Hi, everyone. I'm Don Rooney.
And I'm John Timpane.
Welcome to the Musical Innertube, the podcast born out of a mistake.
We once meant to introduce a soothing musical interlude, but we said soothing musical Innertube, and the name stuck.
On this podcast, we talk to interesting people about their interesting lives, jobs, hobbies, and passions.
Difference makers who really make a difference.
Our guest today on the Musical Innertube is Theodora Ziolkowski, a wonderful novelist and poet. She teaches creative writing at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. Her fiction, poetry, and essays have appeared in more than 60 journals, magazines, anthologies, exhibits, the whole shot. She's been a guest editor all over the place. She has a short story collection titled Mother Tongues and a novella titled On the Rocks, and she's here today to talk about her brand shiny new poetry collection, her first, titled Ghostlit, published by the good people at Texas A&M University Press. Now in publication, it's due out around February the 15th. We are really sparkly happy to welcome Theodora Ziolkowski to the Musical Innertube.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm nothing less than obvious, Theodora. Let me ask you an obvious question. You've published all these things, short story, novella, now poems. Many of the poems in Ghostlit do tell stories, some gestured at, some more directly fleshed out. I'd love to hear you think aloud about what you have to say about the personal subjective experience as telling stories in prose compared to telling it in poetry. You could talk about it any way you'd like, but I'm just very curious about, because it is different, I think. And I'm wondering, from your viewpoint, what would you say?
Yeah, well, I love, I just love writing so much, so I'll write in any form I can. So I'm always greedy to write more. So, but they are very different. And I think, all of my writing comes from imagination as well as experience. And sometimes when I first start writing, I'm not even sure what genre the piece I'm writing will go into. I don't always sit down and think I'm going to write a poem today. I'll start kind of making notes and see where the voice leads me. So with poems, and I'm very, I gravitate toward form. So a lot of the, some of the poems in Ghostlit have very long lines. Some are kind of columned and divided in the middle. That sort of form takes place after a lot of editing and becomes very organic to how I think. But I really don't often sit down with this concrete idea of what genre I'll write, and I really just kind of start with voice and then see where it goes from there. And then once I usually think that the work talks kind of back to me in a way, and it makes clear to me what it's supposed to be.
So that's interesting. Have things started as stories and become poems, or vice versa?
Yes, yeah, that's all. I think a lot of my writing, I write, every day I kind of journal and will write just thoughts. I have a list of just kind of just ideas that have come up, images, and usually I'll use those as sort of a base to craft something. Sometimes I'll have, especially for long form fiction, I think a lot about those stories and I really plot them out of my head before I begin writing. That's very direct in how I kind of channel that energy. But when I just have kind of random images and ideas floating around, and it's like I'm just sifting through a pool and catching something, then it's a little more mysterious what genre I land in. But it's always exciting, and that's one of the reasons that keeps me writing.
Whether it's your poetry or the novellas, I read a little bit of On the Rocks.
Mm-hmm.
You tend to write in first person, which is kind of unique because a lot of people will start out writing third person omniscient. They know everything that's going on, but you plunge right into writing first person. A lot of your, the whole novella's first person. A lot of your poems are first person. Why do you decide to take that route to write instead of the third person?
It's funny you mentioned that because right now the projects I'm working on now are all in third person, so it's fun. It's fun to think back on the.
This was a phase that you were going through, huh?
So you're just what you're telling us is you're just out of rehab, right? And
Yeah, I think, it's funny. I think especially when I was first started writing first person just seemed really accessible to me in a way. And I've had students mention something kind of similar, creative writing students mentioning something similar that can be really fresh and exciting. But I always like to, for each new project, like to invent a new challenge for myself. And so a novel I just finished is in third person close, and then another project I'm working on now is third person omniscient. So, but I like that you picked up on the first person bit from the beginning. I didn't actually think of it that way. That both On the Rocks and then this collection both are very first person heavy.
Speaking of that, we were taught in school not to assume that when there's an I speaking in a poem, that it is the same thing as the author writing. The reason being that it's often not the case. Often the author has created a character. Although, come to think of it, even if you're writing about yourself, you're creating a character. But passing away from that for a moment, I know, but it's interesting. I mean, in these poems, there's a lot of details, and the naive reader coming to it would see the word Houston, for example, floating around. So, I mean, I'm wondering about your feelings about like a reader thinking, oh, well, this is her story. She's writing autobiographical poems. Do you welcome that? Do you think you'd have something to say about it if you could? What do you think?
Well, I have some thoughts. First, to get back to the first person a little bit. I mean, I think one of the reasons I wrote in the first person for Ghostlit and kind of had that consistent character, as you said, speaker character throughout, is because I do think it makes it easy for readers to kind of slip into who that character is or to imagine that experience. And one of my goals, the book is very much about like these cultural ideologies around abuse and the like how it can it's not just the personal, it's across it's backdrops and peoples, and because of that, one way to kind of connect is to just have this personal I communicating with about their experience. So I do think of the speaker as a character, and I think of the husband figure as a character, and it's just this really almost claustrophobic up close look at this one situation. But what I've been gratified to hear is that those who have read advanced copies of it from across, genders, nationalities, I've had responses that they could identify with this speaker in one way, shape, or form, or in their experience. So that was one of the reasons that I chose that but I can definitely see, audiences assuming that it's about the poet, and for sure.
Is that okay? Is that okay?
If asked the question about it, I like to always say, well, this is my creative process. It came from these ideas I wanted to explore, and, but I guess the goal, whatever makes people connect with the book, connect with the book. I just want the poems to reach people. And so, yeah.
When you talk in the first person, when you create your characters for the poetry, for the novellas, for the short stories that I read, you create women who have and are dealing with pain. And again, if we can go back to what John said earlier, if people connect, they go, oh boy, that woman is just steeped in pain and frustration. And she doesn't like men. Oh, men come off terrible in her books. How do you see that? When you're writing it, do you have any of that stuff floating around in your mind, or is it just straight imagery, straight to the page?
I think it's just straight to the page. I think I would have, if I thought too much about what people might think about how I feel about certain things, or how, if I was worried too much about them tying it to who I am as a person or my own beliefs, it might inhibit me. So I just feel like with writing, I have that wonderful pool of the imagination you can just draw from. And with On the Rocks, that book is the novella, that's very much about grief and recursiveness and how grief can manifest in the present. And I think Ghostlit's about that too, just through a different format. So I look at them both as kind of a grief bits, but On the Rocks has more of a humor tilt to it. I'd like to think that some of the poems in Ghostlit have a little bit of humor. Like there's the one with Eurydice, like on a dating app or whatever. So I try to.
That was good. That was a good one. I love that. Well, let's have a little poetry reading here. You've been kind enough to agree to read from the book, and I thought we would begin. First of all, your titles often, they're not so much titles as just lead-ins. They sort of, the convention is to bold, a line that's separated by a space from the body of the poem. But in a lot of ways, you dump us right in medias res, and we're off to the races. So this begins, picture this, and I'd love to hear you read it, and maybe we can talk about it once we've heard it.
Great. Thank you, John. Picture this. You wear girl-sized clothes this summer. Your aunt passes down that porcelain doll. You are 24. It is a family heirloom. He carries your gift on the return flight from Michigan. There is no room in his suitcase. Besides, the doll is delicate. The science says you can't think straight if your brain isn't getting enough protein. The doll requires a cabin seat. You do your homework. The chocolate protein shakes are less chalky than vanilla. You have always been a good student, though this time it is hard to be. The doll would need to get used to the heat. Every day you think, so much is wrong with me. You can see yourself waving as he passes through security, the doll tucked under his arm, but you don't trust that memory. You put the doll on the mantle for everyone to see, but it is mostly just you there, and you are so changed. For 4 years, you and he live in a college town that neither of you can ever quite claim. Even when you are smiling, your face is a broken plate. Morning is the only time of day to run without collapsing from the heat. Before sunup and chocolate shakes, before he wakes, you jog around the complex until you lose feeling.
And again, we are hearing the poetry of Theodora Ziolkowski. That was, what's the whole title? Picture this.
Picture this, you wear girl-sized clothes this summer.
So,
And again, there's
Yeah.
pain in there. But it is a sort of what do you want to say? Universal pain. This is sort of the stuff that goes through everybody's head when they're going through a day, a life. Things that occur to you about yourself and face it, when we talk to ourselves, we're usually not saying, "Hey, I'm great. I'm wonderful." People like that wind up being president of the United States. But ordinary people wind up saying, "Oh, this is what I can't stand about me." And that's kind
Yes,
of what
right.
comes out in your writing. Is that correct?
Mm.
Yeah, it's a very internal sort of, it jumps around, hopscotches around. So definitely. I like to try to mimic the way mind at work would function. So yeah.
I'm so glad you said that, because, and by the way, ladies and gentlemen who are listening, first of all, get Ghostlit. Secondly, when you get it and you see this poem, you'll see that it's what's usually called a prose poem. That is basically the only thing I know what that means, is that both edges are justified. It runs from one edge to the other, so it appears to be a block of prose. But as you just heard, of course, the tensions are what we associate with poetry and the movement. And it does move like a mind moves, and that is by association, by intrusion, by sometimes, it seems to me, you can tell better than I can, but I think that that part of memory which is involuntary, those little involuntary stabs of memory and image, I think that's, in there too. That's just my, reaction to it. The thing I wanted to say is, we've all read Chekhov about the gun on the mantelpiece, and I have to congratulate you that the doll does not fall from the mantelpiece and smash in the poem. Instead, there's a smile that's like a broken plate. It belongs. And by the way, congratulations. This is in second person. This is a second person poem.
Yeah.
Right. No, I mean, we chose the poem that was, not any person's. I mean, second person is by far the least used because, well, it's hard. I'm sure you can tell me more, but so we're right, and Don's right, and I'm right, that we're really, in a way, we're in the presence of the movement of a mind here, a movement of a sensibility. Is that okay to say?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Mm. The presence of pain is there,
Yeah.
and so forth and so on. But it's also the thing that I want to ask you about is that there's something's being played with here that has to do with just how experience hits us, and I only say that because of the associational aspect of it. that we can't really choose what's going to happen to us. It's going to happen as it
Right.
happens. And I'm thinking the field, a person is sort of the mind, as you've been talking about, the imagination is kind of a field, and things come to you in that field and you work in that field. But here too, I mean, it's about a person to whom things happen. We might not be able to draw a linear line,
Mhm.
but so I don't know. That seems to be something you're playing with.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. Another way I've kind of thought about it is it's a person who, or a character who's like she's always looking for ways to control like the situation some ways when she's feels uncontrolled in other ways. So this poem, I mean, there are other poems in the book that do this, but alludes to like controlled eating, or that's one form in which that kind of takes place. And so, yeah, and she also like looks to, there are a lot of poems where she's looking to something to kind of explain her situation or to understand it differently. So whether it's mythology or film, the cover of the book has that great eye that reminds me, it's very Hitchcockian, which I
Yes.
really love that. And so, yeah, she's looking to film, to art, to mythology, to music. She's always looking to something else to explain what's going on or to see herself differently.
Are you
So,
one of those people that walks around with a notebook? And when an idea hits you, you're going to write it down and then go back, maybe flesh it out? Or,
yes. Yeah.
yeah.
I'm worse than that, Don. Sometimes I'll turn on the voice memo, app on my phone and just start talking. So okay, I'm
Oh,
one of
yeah.
those. So yeah. So I always like to have something on hand so I can
The
get it
suffering
down.
of this episode is going to be appearing soon in a book by Theodora Ziolkowski before long.
Oh, no.
Well, wonderful. I think. Well, I just wanted to say. You say we search for points of comparison in order to understand our own experience. We often search for other people's experience and compare ourselves to what they're going through in what we think might be analogous circumstances. Right? I mean, we're always searching, and neither the search nor what it dredges up is necessarily linear or even useful.
Right.
But in fact, somebody tells one of the speaking eyes in one of your poems, I can't remember which one, that you shouldn't have recourse to metaphor so often. I can't remember the
Oh,
line.
right.
Yes,
Yeah.
So I mean, that's part of what we're talking about here is that we try to understand ourselves and we reach for things that can stand for what we're going through, and that's
Mhm.
metaphorization, isn't it? And
Mhm.
um, I'd love you to talk more about that.
Yeah, no, that poem you're referring to, I think it's a therapist tells the character of the speaker not to do that. So there's a self-awareness to kind of the act of doing that, to
Yes.
the act of doing that as well. So, yeah, I just, a lot of the poems too are really, they have a strong sense of setting. So whether it's in Houston or, across the pond and, in, there are poems there's one poem in Paris, there's some poems in Rome, the Amalfi Coast. Um, all those two gave me a lot of opportunities to examine art and different surroundings and peoples and places. So I think that gave me another way to kind of do that through the speaker, through the character of the
Terrific.
kind of mouthpiece of these poems.
We'll return to our podcast in just a moment. But first, here's a soothing musical interlude.
Theodora Ziolkowski teaches creative writing as an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska at Kearney.
She holds an MFA from the University of Alabama and a PhD in creative writing and literature from the University of Houston.
Her fiction, poetry, and essays have appeared in The Writer's Chronicle, Short Fiction from England, and Prairie Schooner, among more than 60 other literary journals, magazines, anthologies, and exhibits.
Among her books is a short story collection titled Mother Tongue. She has also written a novella, On the Rocks, which was a winner of a 2018 Next Generation Indie Book Award.
On the Rocks is now available as an audiobook on Audible. Theodora's brand new poetry collection, her first, is titled Ghostlit. Now we return you to the musical Innertube, already in progress.
A lot of the poems and even more of your prose have to do with earth, animals, that sort of thing. There are geese that pop up constantly in your work. There are topics that almost are medieval, I want to say. When these people are working the world, the earth, they're working it not with modern plows and tractors and everything, but they're actually out there with their fingers. And you have a piece of prose where a woman cuts the back of her hand with her trowel while she's digging. Do you have a background at all in farming or anything like that, or is that just sort of an imagery that you like?
I think it's imagery that I like. My backdrop, I one kind of you said something about medieval, sort of the way that I look at animals. Oh, I love the Gothic. So I think a lot of what I work with has a fairy tale or Gothic sort of bend to it. And that's especially when I was first writing fairy tales. That's how I access. That's how I kind of learned how to write a story, was looking at the shape of fairy tales, because they already have an architecture to them. And so I would kind of reuse that to be able to figure out how to make a shape. I found that astonishingly hard when I was first writing, is how to figure out the shape for fiction as well as for poetry. And yeah, the shape of a narrative. So I think that comes from there. And then whenever I'm I've been fortunate to get to live in different places and to visit other places. But, in terms of the states, I'm from Pennsylvania, but I've lived in Vermont, I lived in Alabama, I've lived in Houston, and I live in Nebraska. And so they all have such different geographies, and I'm very attentive to sort of the flora and fauna around me. I'm very interested in that, just as a person. So I've never thought of my work as kind of like having that in it as much as you mentioned on. So I appreciate that so much, because I do love that.
There's a certain something in the prose and in the poetry that's very ethereal. That sort of, and this is why I keep coming back to what you're thinking, what the mind is going through, because there's a lot of, it's first person, but it's you looking at the world and reacting to what's going on. And you don't always react in the way that people would think that you would react. There's a little bit of a something going on that has to do with the suffering, but also has to do with the way they perceive everything that's coming at them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that those kind of give you an opportunity to do that too. I mean, just thinking on the fly with how you mentioned that. I mean,
Of course.
yeah, I think that's a really neat, wonderful observation.
I bet you didn't think you were going to get a psychological dress down on this program, but that's what we're here for.
So continuing the reading, you have generously agreed to read a poem that uses the word bitch repeatedly. I thought I'd just mention that so that if readers feel they might not like it, first of all, I want to say it only makes the poem richer, and to come into it with that, this is not a bad-mouthed poem at all. And I'd love you to read the Lying in the Hospital Bed, one of two that begins with those words in the book.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you, John. Lying in the hospital bed, I wonder why every song I love contains the word bitch. Then the nurse takes my hand, asks if I want to watch TV. I am my most vulnerable, waiting for surgery. About a girl, she socks my feet. Her tone is congratulatory, my smock a snowbank gaping at the back, red ties bowed into winter berries. There is poison inside me. Normally, I crank the volume up on my headphones, but today that's unnecessary, as I will be sleeping. I can't stop thinking about those songs I play as the doctor peers inside me. According to Google, bitches were originally trained to sniff out prey. Then they were expected to keep the house clean, lest a mole expose them as bitches and thus destine those witches to burn at the stake. I have never felt more inside of my body as when I found myself without my husband, alone in another country. Now the nurse searches my arm for a vein, and I consider how there is no gray area. The bitch in every song I love is either adored or hated. Cue audience applause as the nurse changes the channel and a woman ices a cake on TV. Bitches mean dogs, but to bitch means complaining, i.e., the way bitches about endless piles of laundry. Unfortunately, there is no way to remove your nose ring, the doctor proclaims, i.e., there is an occasion, though not likely, for radiation burning. Please sign and initial your understanding. It ought to have been a sign that marriage turned my initials into the shorthand for disease evinced by blood coughed into handkerchiefs, and that ending my time as his wife made me prone to reclaiming the years I was silenced. This is where we'll be extracting, the doctor holds a diagram to explain, but practice makes me translate her science into the same anxiety I carried that first night I felt a hand at my waist, then registered the absence of a ring. I poured myself a glass of white wine and laughed my ass off at that party, kept my bitching behind my teeth. Time to be wheeled away, and the nurse squeezes my hand with a tenderness that makes my throat ache. I once saw a performance where the singer wanders through a bright forest of ethereal birches until disease devours the plot as her bitch dogs bark. I often wonder for how long those bad cells were a part of me. I mean, at what point did they take a turn for the worse?
Ugh. I don't know. I love poetry. I try to write the stuff myself. I'm part of a poetic sort of demi-monde here in the Philadelphia area, and I can't decide what is the more powerful, to read a poem to oneself or to hear it read by someone else. I feel as though in this case, I decided not to look at the text and just to have you speak the poem to me. And it seems like an absolutely separate experience from when I first read it. I'd love to hear you think aloud about that for a moment.
Yeah, I love that experience of if you first encounter a poem on paper and then you hear it read or vice versa. It can be a very different experience, especially if you hearing different inflections of different people reading the same work too. It can be a very different experience. Something I like to do as a teacher is when a student is up for workshop with a poem, I like to have the poet read it and then someone else in the class read it so the poet can hear the poem being read by someone else and hear what it sounds like. Poetry is an oral form. So I think it's really lovely to be able to have that echoed back to them.
That penultimate section where you report that you once saw a performance where the singer wanders through a bright forest of ethereal birches until disease devours the plot as her bitch dogs bark. And first of all, I just love, there's some sumptuous consonant mongering going on. I love it. I love, the bright and the birches and the bitch dogs barking. It's a lot of bees, a lot of music going on. But there is also, there are moments in your poetry, I find anyway, where something nails it, whatever it is, you might not even have known, but there's something that just seems to just shout out, its authenticity from the poem. But the phrase for me that really struck me that way was, the disease devours the plot, because I'll tell you why, because disease does. Disease does. I mean, that's the fear, isn't it? That if you have a disease, and a couple of your speaking characters here in the poems do, that it may devour the plot in the sense that it devours me in my world. I'm thinking devourment, and also the fact that this poem also touches on what I think of myself, what has happened to me, even the word bitch, which it's aggressive, it's actually an act of aggression when one uses it. I think it's one of the reasons it became enshrined in rap and hip hop lyrics. Is it was an expression of, just, being actively forward, let's put it. But all that is happening in those little words. It's so explosive. I'd love to hear you react.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I mean, and to get to what you were saying about the birches and bitch, the way that the sounds kind of work, I mean, that was
Yeah.
one of the real fun parts of the poem for me is thinking, and this is
Mhm.
one of those poems that, to get back to something we were saying earlier, that I did go into this knowing I was writing a poem about this. This is one of those things
Oh,
where I kind of had the concept and then I had the first line and then I chased the rest of the line. And so the kind of fun, part I love about revision, and especially in poetry, is really finding the sound and the different, the different ways I can draw on image and sound to kind of achieve that effect. So I love that you were mentioning, the end there. And of course, just even the repetition of the word bitch. I mean, that's kind of the driving kind of heartbeat of the poem,
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
Well, and it's, yeah.
Or Love Is, which is what they renamed the Rolling Stones song Bitch for the radio.
So they could play it.
I was a disc jockey, and for years I finally was able to play Bitch, but for years I could only play Love Is because they didn't want you to say bitch on the radio. Going back to what John said about the alliteration and the musicality of it, I love your imagery too. You talk in that poem about the hospital gown like a snowbank, and I know that in the on the rocks, your character talks about talking to a therapist, like climbing a ladder where the rungs are made of pudding. Which I love,
yes,
because of all that says, and that also goes back into the humor that you inject in all these things. Even when you're talking about very painful things, there's humor there. There's a level of self-deprecation and humor in there that this seems to leaven it out. Is that kind of where you're going with this stuff?
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm, one way in which I'm like this character is I am like that as a I'm always trying to be kind of humorous. Or that's one way in which I communicate. So yeah, definitely.
Terrific. There's so much in a collection of poems, and they're slim little books, but I often tell people, if you're going to open one, be ready to get into all sorts of stuff. You're not going to be able to just put it down and read it cover to cover. You're going to return to certain things. It'll get its hooks in you. And I think this does. I think there are not just the images, which of course are stunning. I mean, there's so many. I wrote down so many wonderful lines. Smiling is painful after poison. I think it is. Don't you, Don? I mean, I think...
I don't know. I've never taken poison, but I would assume that smiling would not be one of the first things.
Could you try it?
Yes, John. I'll try it later.
There's a fact of memory and there is a fact of feeling, which is so precise. I mean, but in a minute you realize, well, yeah, the feeling comes to tell us things the memory might not, and vice versa. I mean, they're sort of in worlds that are often very separable and separate. And but here's one that really just knocked me down the street. Even the dead don't provide closure. The ghosts keep coming. Hello. I mean, for us, the living, death is not the end. I mean, other people's.
Let me ask you a question too about that. How many times do people come up to you and say, in your book, in your poem, that thing, that's me, right? Your friends, and they find themselves in your work.
Oh,
does that happen a lot to you?
Thank God.
Okay.
Thank
Good.
goodness. I mean, knock on wood. But I mean, everything is from. I really think everything's for writers from experience and imagination. Like everything comes from you. We're all just sponges for what's around us. So, but the great part about writing is you get to put a tilt on everything. So. But yeah, but Don, that has not happened to me yet. But I've heard of it happening a lot. But
okay,
yeah,
all right. Because I was just wondering if somebody comes up and says, again, on the rocks, Ted Turbine, that's me, that right? Just wondering. I'm not saying it was me, but I'm saying that people could see themselves in some of these characters that you paint.
Yeah, Ted Turbine would be particularly a funny one for someone to claim. So
yeah, very much.
Well, we have had a wonderful half hour with Theodora Ziolkowski, and her new book is Ghostlit. Thank you, Theodora Ziolkowski, for coming over. All the best with your lovely new collection.
Well, thank you so much, Don and John. It's been a real treat being here, so thank you.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Hey, let us know how we're doing. Send us an email at musicalinnertube, all one word, @gmail.com.
Do you know someone with a great story to tell? Let us know. Send us an email or log in to our website, musicalinnertube.com, and click on the microphone in the lower right-hand corner to leave us a voicemail.
And while you're on our website, take a few minutes to listen to past episodes of the podcast. They're all there, along with pictures and biographies of our guests, blog posts, and lots more.
And as always, our thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for providing us with our theme music.